Welcome to the New Ventures podcast. Our guest for today is Karim Jabbar, the CEO and co-founder of Solstream. Welcome, Karim.
Thank you, Sanjoy. It's a real pleasure to be with you today.
You enable the generation of carbon credits from decentralized renewable energy systems. Let's start by talking about how critically important this is for both the climate and the development standpoint.
Yes, very good start, Sanjoy. So a little bit about the big problem. Solar or energy access as such is a big problem. You have over 700 million people in the world today who don't have any kind of electricity access, and also around 1 billion people who have very poor energy access. So currently, this means that those people will have to rely on very dirty fuel sources in order to meet their needs. Here we're talking about using firewood, so deforestation, using kerosene lamps, using diesel generators. Just to give you an example, if you aggregate the CO2 emissions caused by just kerosene lamps, it actually accumulates to more than 7 times the CO2 emissions of the country of Denmark that I live in. So it seems like a no-brainer to try to solve this issue and replace these dirty sources of fuel with a simple solution, so solar home systems, which is something that essentially our company tries to address by contributing to that acceleration of deployment of solar home systems across the developing world.
And when you say developing world, this problem is really an African problem, right? I mean, though it's there in other parts, and I know you've done work in Southern America as well, but very seriously an issue in Africa.
Absolutely correct. The center of gravity of this problem is primarily sub-Saharan Africa. And you mentioned we do work in countries such as Colombia and Mexico, that although you could say, generally speaking, they would have grids that are somehow functioning and operational pretty well, you still have pockets of completely isolated populations who don't have access to electricity at all. So here also, it's high on the radar of the governments of those countries to actually enable operators that deploy off-grid systems. This could be microgrids, mini-grids, solar home systems into those areas. And generally speaking, whether we're talking Latin America or sub-Saharan Africa, the biggest issue is the cost of extending the grid. It would simply cost way too much to, first of all, make the grid reliable where it actually is and well functioning for the increasing populations of the big cities in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and at the same time extending that grid to reach the remote rural areas. So it's a much more cost-effective solution to go straight off grid on a new technology. So essentially using renewable energy from the outset in small mini-grid, microgrid type of installations or standalone systems such as solar home systems.
Great. I think one of the things you have already done, which is to define what the word decentralized renewable energy systems mean. I mean, you've already talked about solar home systems and microgrids. In the big picture problem, one of the things that you talked about was carbon emissions, but obviously the use of firewood, for example, which you alluded to, leads to deforestation. That itself leads to carbon emissions. It reduces carbon sequestration possibilities and potential, but it also is a huge challenge on the adaptation side. So that's an important issue as well.
Absolutely, and this is why addressing the problem is vital, because you could say avoidance of these practices is essentially a big contributor to trying to save the carbon sinks that we have remaining, rather than continuing to cut down forest in order to use it for firewood. A simple replacement not only replaces the kerosene, but also protects the forest. And added to this, you'd have a whole range of co-benefits that are healthcare related, for example. As an example, every year, 1.5 million people die in accidents related to kerosene lamps. So the numbers are huge, and not just black carbon related diseases based on poor breathing conditions inside households. The ability to study at night, to have productive lives is greatly diminished if you don't have this immediate and direct access to energy. So what makes these types of actions or activities extra beneficial is that we're not just talking about typical carbon avoidance, but it's also a carbon avoidance with a lot of very positive social co-benefits, and that is worth taking into consideration. And you're correct, it's all part of an ecosystem where one action essentially affects another, and at the end of the day, the scale of this is much larger than just a simple kerosene lamp that can easily be replaced.
So having established now the problem and the big impact, you also mentioned, of course, that you worked in Mexico and Colombia. but you've worked with some of the largest companies in off-grid solar in Africa, such as NG and Greenlight Africa. So what is the benefit these companies get from selling carbon credits through your platform?
So just to set the stage a little bit, you could say the carbon market that we currently have obviously relies on this mechanism where you have projects that either avoid or remove emissions on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you would have CO2 emitting companies in other parts of the world that would essentially compensate for that emission by purchasing these carbon credits that are created somewhere else. And the mechanism itself is sound on a scientific basis. It doesn't make any difference whether, a ton emitted in one country or another country, doesn't matter. It's one global atmosphere, so to speak. So the mechanism itself, it's sound, but it has also been prone to a lot of issues and problems in the past related to fraud and so on. We can talk about that if necessary, and how we actually address that by trying to make the system more trusted. But generally speaking, you could say the existing system is based on a centralized approach, meaning that the types of projects that were typically allowed to be included in this sort of compensation mechanism would be larger centralized types of systems, large hydroelectric plants for avoidances, similarly to large wind farms, and solar as well, utility scale type of stuff. And of course, the credits sold would help in turn bring down the cost of the technology so it actually becomes affordable and more deployable where it's actually needed. And the similar thing with forestry projects, usually large projects, it takes a lot of capital and time in order to get the credits ready for purchase. So a typical cycle with a verification body would take 3 years or so, and a lot of upfront fees that you need to pay in order to get a project put on rails, so to speak, so it can ultimately lead to issuance of carbon credits, which will be registered or listed on one of the registries of the voluntary market. It could be the gold standard registry, the CDM registry, Verra registry, which is the one that holds the verified carbon standard projects. So all this essentially means that whoever wants to get into this space needs to have the liquidity upfront to invest in this in order to reap the benefits at a later stage. Sometimes 3, 4, 5 years later, once the credits are issued, then you actually start selling the credits with all the uncertainty of what the market would look like in the future, making it very difficult for you to actually account for, is the investment actually worth it? So there's a scale issue, there's a time issue. And the scale issue is that as soon as you go down to a certain size of projects, this becomes very, difficult to address. So you would typically have setups such as program of activities that essentially makes it easier for smaller projects to join in. But still, the business model is the same. It's a business model where you need to pay money up front and you have to wait a certain amount of time, a lot of diligence done in order to do field-based type of verification before carbon credits can be issued. So in our particular context, we realized that a lot of the operators in the off-grid solar space are dealing with very small units deployed at a massive scale. So massively distributed small systems, which when you aggregate them, make up a considerable volume, which should definitely be monetizable in terms of issuing and selling carbon credits. But the current methodologies do not really allow for it. So having talked to a lot of these players, we realized that we can try to help the volume issue by aggregating. So aggregation by having one company that essentially deals with all of them at once should bring the numbers aligned so it actually can become a good business case. And also we're going to need to be creative when it comes to the business model itself and the use of technology in order to bring down, say, the cost of verification so that a smaller project, distributed setups, such as the distributors of solar home systems, can actually participate in this carbon market. So this is what we've created with Solstream. It's essentially a technology-driven system, very much reliant on the data that these partners of ours have. You mentioned the NG Energy Access. We just made an agreement with them for their systems in Kenya. Similarly with the Greenlight Planet, that is well known for the Sun King product range, which is the most distributed solar home system and lanterns and so on, solar lanterns across Africa. They have over 3 million, pay-go units deployed in sub-Saharan Africa. So for us, it's essentially figuring out a way, how do we leverage all this? And this is done by working with software providers that are already used in the space. So here we're talking about and Gaza, last mile distribution software, as well as PayG, which does more or less the same thing. And we're currently also looking at PayGup Solaris to try to build an integration with them as well. So essentially, it's a simple solution where operators or distributors who are running these types of products can connect via the data that they're doing, that they're collecting from these solar home systems, payment data, for example. Usually these systems will be sold on a payment plan. And as long as the payment plan keeps rolling in and people pay for the system, it either unlocks the system, in case of the more advanced systems that can be turned off in case people default, or not. But essentially, in order to keep it as correct as possible, we have found a way to connect payments to actual energy consumption. So we would assume that, let's say, if you have paid X amount of Kenya shillings for a system in month X, that means you will essentially have X number of days of use of that particular solar system. That in turn means a replacement of kerosene and diesel to a specific amount, essentially using the carbon methodology calculation in order to issue then a very small fraction of a carbon credit for each single payment. So what we do is scale-based, so massively distributed systems, and every single payment recorded gets transformed into a carbon value, which is stored on this next generation carbon registry, you can call it, which is based on a distributed ledger system so that it becomes tamper-proof. And from this registry, potential buyers, corporations, and so on, can essentially buy and retire the credits from the system the same way as you would do if you buy it from the Vera registry or a gold standard type of product. And to be aligned with these, the way of doing things, we're also third-party verified, meaning that the methodology that we use, which is a CDM methodology in order to quantify the carbon avoidances, is essentially verified by DNV, the large Norwegian company that I'm sure you're familiar with if you work in the energy space, that is quite known for ISO standard setting and these types of verification processes. They have a big carbon team that has been helping us, in a nutshell, verifying that the methodology is correct, that it's codified correct, and the use of the data is handled according to best practices. So this gives assurance from the buyers on the corporate side of things that when they buy a carbon avoidance credit from Solstream, let's say from a Greenlight Planet system deployed in Kenya, that there is a 100% traceability, and you can actually see very specifically on the system at which specific times was the system in use, essentially triggering the carbon avoidance, also where exactly this system located through a geohash. So all this transparency of information makes the data extremely granular, and it allows you to trust in the fact that what you have bought is actually something that is proven to have happened through third-party verified data, which is a new approach, you could say, to the more generic estimation-based calculation that are usually used for massively distributed projects such as cook stoves and so on. Usually you would deploy tens of thousands of those, but you wouldn't really know if they're in use or not in use and so on. But you would need to trust that the carbon avoidance has actually happened. Whereas here we can prove that it has happened. So we consider this a carbon credit that is premium in the sense that it adds this level of transparency and trust, but also at the same time, it has all the co-benefits, the social benefits that I mentioned earlier. So I guess because of the fact that we've managed to put ourselves at the intersection of the carbon market and the solar off-grid system, and that we put carbon credits at the forefront of what we do as an enhancement to what everybody else does, we become kind of an ecosystem play or a solution that essentially enhances the work of all the others in the space. So in that sense, we have seen so far, and luckily enough, a lot of the big distributors gravitating towards us, trying to see if we can collaborate, because it dramatically reduces the time to market from you decide to actually set up a carbon project until you actually have credits that are ready for selling. And at the same time, it allows you to do it, although you don't have the capital up front in order to be able to do that. So the revenue that we will get and the fees that will be paid will only be paid once the carbon credits sell. So in that sense, we remove as much as possible the barriers for these companies so that they can access the market.
That's fine. What I'll do is I'll kind of unpack it. You've obviously had a lot of points there, and I'm glad that you sort of summarized it right there. What you're saying is that typically a large, hydropower developer or a large solar IPP can put up a project and sell carbon credits because they are large, they have the liquidity. It becomes difficult for a company which is selling from hundreds of 20-watt systems, literally thousands of 20-watt systems, to sell these carbon credits. And what you are doing is essentially making this a program so that those hundreds and thousands of systems can sort of be aggregated and sell carbon credits on your platform. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, great. And then the second point is that because the way this works is Greenlight Planet sells, manufactures the lantern, that's the solar home systems under its brand, but it puts on top of that a software, perhaps run by Angaza, which really tracks when it is used, when the payment is made, where it is used, and so on and so forth. So you pick up the data directly, and then you can tell and then you translate that to carbon credits, because what you're capturing is energy data. You translate that to carbon credits, and there is complete transparency on where the solar electricity is produced, or what you call carbon avoidance has happened. Is that correct?
Yes, that's also correct.
Okay, great. And then what will be useful to understand is what DNV does, and maybe we can get into that later, because what is it that they verify?
Yes, it's a very, very pertinent question. So you could say DNV, in this particular case, they are verifying that we are implementing a CDM methodology, so UN CDM methodology, specifically designed for off-grid solar, small scale. It's a methodology from 2015 that was developed by the World Bank and other stakeholders. It went through a very thorough, you could say, methodology review, as these things have to go through. And it was updated on a few instances. And the one that is currently, available in the registry of methodologies on the CDM website is the one that we have actually used. So it's version 3 of that particular methodology. So what we have done is taken that methodology that has yearly calculations of yields of solar systems, generally speaking, and we have converted the metrics into daily metrics rather than yearly metrics, so that we can issue on a daily basis rather than wait and bulk issue once a year, so that we can get more dynamic flow in the system and create, again, more, you could say, transparency of sorts. So they ensure that what we have done in transforming the calculations to a daily calculation is actually correct. So they have their data scientists and the carbon people look at that. And then they ensure that the codification of it is done correctly. And this is where they kind of have an edge, we would say, compared to, pure, could say, carbon verifiers, generally speaking, that use a field-based approach, is that they have a whole practice which is about data science and about the technology platform verification. They have certain standards for verifying IT platforms, and we have gone through an audit process of that. So essentially, their data scientists and computer scientists have gone through our system to ensure that we have codified this in a correct fashion, so that we don't. So at the end of the day, there's not a small miscalculation that ends up being a large amount once you aggregate it. So it's down to 4 or 5 commas after each gram. So it's extremely precise, and the numbers are essentially properly verified. Added to this, they also verify that the data transfer that we get from the likes of Angaza is actually also done correctly. So the tech side of things is done correctly, and that we handle the due diligence data with the solar distributors in a correct fashion. So we have a checklist of things that need to be submitted to us upfront before you can join the program. So we need to know that we have a printout from the company registry in the given country to ensure that it's a legitimate business that we're dealing with. We need to have the latest annual report, so we can see what the status of the company is, in order for us to put the required check marks to ensure that we're letting in, well-established players, and it's not a random project just created or designed for the simple purpose of generating bogus carbon credits. So all these checks and steps are done very diligently, put in place by them, and they would upfront verify the whole program and the whole system, making it easier for them to do ongoing spot checks. And this is where it becomes interesting, because this is where you can reduce the cost tremendously. So they don't need to have boots on the ground, so to speak, with every single distributor that we onboard at any given time, so that they can double check that all these massively deployed small systems are actually in use. They will review the data on the system to ensure that what is there, that the data speaks for itself, so to speak. So that reduces the cost. You don't have to be in the field as much, and you can do spot checks, and the system can kind of automatically pick up on discrepancies in the data in case they happen. So in case all of a sudden, we get a surge in amount of data transmitted from one distributor, we will know that it goes beyond a certain threshold that they shouldn't be allowed to, go beyond. And we would know that there's something wrong with the data, whether it's malicious or whether it's a fake. We will be able to pick up on that very quickly and solve the problem so that we don't issue any credits at all that are not based on actual real data. So the cost reduction comes from the use of the technology to allow us to do this the verification largely ahead of time, so that new partners can join in without being subjected to very heavy due diligence from the DNV itself. And you could say strategically, this was very good for us that DNV was actually looking into ways of doing real-time verification, because verification is the core of their business. They do it for all kinds of projects. And they're looking at ways to leveraging technology in order to come up with new offerings to all their corporate partners that are working with them for verification purposes. And in this particular case, they see good use of technology that can be leveraged in order to reduce the cost for the recipients at the end of the day, for the projects that are actually much in need of that financial flow going their way from selling the carbon credits. So we were kind of lucky to hit an inflection point in time where DNV were looking strategically into data-driven verification, and we were at the same time trying to do methodologies that were data-driven. So collectively, we kind of designed the system, where we designed it, they verified it for us, but we see it pretty much as a synergetic kind of relationship where this can be a blueprint, hopefully, that we're looking at reproducing for other types of distributed systems. So for example, clean cooking and sanitation and all these things that collectively, when you aggregate them, have a big impact on the environment. You could, using data, do similar things as we have done with solar here.
So just make sure that I understand the main points. What DNV has done in the methodology is the following key elements. DNV has created a methodology so that you onboard partners who have a certain credibility. That's point number one. Point number two is the methodology also includes verification of the veracity of the data that you pick up from the likes of Angasa. These two together, what it does is it solves a problem which you referred to earlier. That is, a verification of carbon credits is a long and costly process where consultants have to be hired. This sort of automates it, makes it easier for people to put up systems and earn money. Is that kind of a summary?
That's correct.
Okay, wonderful. And what you said, one more thing that we should understand is that issue carbon credits now on a daily basis. What you mean is that it is sold on a real-time, just to make sure that I understand that.
Well, it means that we would get, if you stick to the technical side of things, we have a mirroring, so to speak, into the Angasa data or the account of the solar distributor on Angasa, for example. We will essentially be able to see every day when that data is updated, and we will see if there's new solar installations that have been added with a legitimate account number and so on. And from the get-go, as soon as those systems are added to the pool of systems, we can essentially start, issuing credits based on that particular data that we get in. So it's a daily update of the status of the whole, you could say, installed base of the distributor. And every single time there is a payment made, or every single time there is a reading of an actual energy consumption for the types of systems that are more advanced and have that are GSM enabled and that essentially, track real-time data electricity consumption. We get for every single reading, we create a micro carbon avoidance, which we actually call it. So essentially, all these together add up to tonnages, but at any given time, we're issuing as little as a few kilos, 2, 3, 5, 60, 70 kilos at a time per reading. So very small increments every day, every week. And when you add them up, over the course of a year, an average solar home system will have issued around 250 kilos of carbon avoidance. which is actually not that much in the grand scheme of things. But if you aggregate it, as you say, with hundreds of thousands of systems all deployed and all doing the same, you get all of a sudden a very, very clear image of where things are happening and where the stuff was issued, at exactly what time were the systems in use or paid for. That is the daily element, so that we don't wait until once a year and do a general calculation of what does the data say, and then we bulk issue for that particular provider. It happens on the go, allowing them to add on batches of solar home systems as they bring them to market right away. We shouldn't wait 2-3 years. As soon as things are online, the data starts flowing, then the carbon credit should automatically start being issued. So that is what we have managed to do.
Great. So the additional money that comes to the companies should theoretically perhaps lead to lower interest rates that the customer has to pay. Have you seen already evidence of this happening?
Absolutely. So that's the whole idea with these credits, is that the extra revenue should sustain the business and allow the business to do one of two things, or a combination of the two. So either lowering the cost for the prices for the existing customer base, or going to areas which you wouldn't usually serve because they're even further away, or the distribution costs are disproportionately high compared to the potential revenue that you can make. So essentially, the further away you are from the centers of activity and the more remote the villages, the less it makes business sense to actually go there, even if it's a very low cost system that you're deploying with a pay-go solution with very small monthly fees in order to pay off the system. Still over half the people in those areas would not be able to afford it. So having these carbon credits, the revenues from them, allows these companies to actually dare take the steps towards going into areas where they otherwise wouldn't have gone. And specifically to your question, whether we have seen it happening, the honest and straightforward answer is not yet, because the backlog we have of our traction doesn't go back long enough back for us to be able to actually give you a clear indication that that is actually what is happening. Assumption here is that if a company that is otherwise, a lot of these solar distributors are pretty much struggling with their cash flow and they're constantly fundraising, trying to essentially stay afloat. And just by the fact that they're allowed to be, revenues allow them to continue their operations, we see this as an additional revenue which lives up to all the additionality criteria of carbon offsetting and so on. It justifies the credit being sold and the money being made. But we are aware of the fact that more precision as to what the money is actually spent on is something that we are in the process of actually developing further as we go forward. And the simple way of doing that is essentially saying, well, if we sell to large corporations, for example, this traceability beyond the distributor all the way to the recipient is actually something that could be very much valued. So now we're talking actually to some of our distributors about, in the case of bulk purchases of carbon credits, so large volumes of thousands of tons of credits at a time. Here it makes sense to say, well, that particular revenue, which then becomes sizable, should actually be earmarked very specifically to either going into new areas of operation or geographies of operation that you otherwise wouldn't have served, or very specifically, go to a cost reduction for a price reduction on the services to a given customer segment in a given area. And that would be easily trackable, the same way as the way you would do it with results-based finance. Once you show that the result is actually deployed in a very specific area, that is what triggers essentially the payment. So these types of mechanisms is something that we're looking into. And all the distributors are very much aware of that. And what we're at the current stage of our development, we're selling credits on behalf of the partners that we have on board, but the volumes that we have sold so far do not still add up so that we can have a long enough history to be able to say very specifically where has the money actually gone. But that's part of what we will do, ex post. Every year it will become more encouraged that these partners actually share that type of data with us, because that also enhances their ability to actually sell their respective carbon credits to the buyers.
It's interesting the way you compared the bulk purchase and the incentive structure with results-based financing. A couple of weeks back, we had Martin Bean, the head of SNV's energy program, on our podcast talking exactly about the same thing, results-based financing. So let's discuss a little bit of the process. DNV has set up a checklist of what you should go through before a company can come on your platform. If you can help us understand, for example, if there's a new pay-as-you-go company in let's say Kenya or Tanzania or somewhere to come to you, what is the information they should provide?
So usually the process is, first of all, aligning, you could say, expectations. So it's pretty clear, essentially, what is the opportunity and what would the cost be for the respective parties. So although we're lowering the costs, tremendously and making it very affordable for smaller projects and companies to actually come on board, it is still a tech integration that needs to be done with the system in use, or the account within a system that is in use for one of these partners. And it still costs man hours. So we would have a certain threshold in terms of amounts of systems. And we appreciate that some systems are quite small, some as small sometimes as 7-watt panels or 10-watt panels. So very small entities with one LED light bulb or what have you, which essentially is just a step up from solar lantern, and all the way to proper larger systems that run 350-watt panels and 1.2 kilowatt hour a day battery capacity, which can power many more appliances. And add a few of those, you can run a kiosk with fridges and whatever is required. So we understand that it's different, but for each partner at our current stage, we want to engage in an informal dialogue to ensure that we are in agreement. So we have a calculator and an Excel sheet, so very simple. We get the partners to fill it out with our help to actually say, well, based on the sizes of your installations, the way you monitor it, whether you can prove that it's on, and usually, how many days over a year is it actually on. We basically fill out the sheet, and it will give you a potential yield of carbon credits per year. And based on different price scenarios, we can say, well, best case scenario, it could yield you this amount of money. Worst case, it will be something around there. And there is also the issue that you might not be able to sell all your credits all at once. We're still waiting, you could say, for demand to really eclipse supply, which we think is in the process of happening these years as the demand really increases. And we're probably going to talk about this in a second. So once we agree that this is a good opportunity and the amount of carbon credits potentially generated is good for both parties, we would then start the formal process, which is essentially part of it is a tick box, so to speak. So we have a type form that we will send out. People essentially need to categorize their company. They need to upload certain documentation. So it could be their annual report. It could be the spec sheets for their solar home system, so we know exactly which ones are deployed where. And also we would require some sort of third-party, you could say, audited statement, which is left very, very light, which is essentially just a third-party vouching for the amounts of system in deployment, so that we know that this is actually the amount of the installed base, so that we don't end up doing an integration and then we get, as I mentioned before, a surge of, fake data. So this is also a reason why we primarily work with third-party software vendors, because it's much more secure to get the actual live data from their accounts from Angaza, for example, rather than getting an export from the company itself. So once these things are submitted, the next step would be to draft the partnership agreement, where the fees are actually negotiated. We have a very standardized fee structure that all the partners pretty much have adhered to so far. There's some generic terms for website sales, the stuff that we sell on our website, which is sold in small increments to smaller businesses. And here the prices would be relatively high for the voluntary carbon market. People would see it as a premium. It would be priced at 26 euros per ton, which we think is absolutely fair, and it should definitely go up in the future. But then you would also have, you could say, sales that are in larger quantities. You could say people, if a given corporate company comes to the solar provider and says, well, we like your company and the way you address energy access in this particular country. We would like to buy the credits from a given batch of solar home systems, but we can pay this and that price. Then it becomes subject to negotiation with the buyer, and we would try to settle on something which is fair for all parties, but at the end of the day ensures that we also get our upfront verification fees that we're paying for DNV to actually do the verification work, all the work that we have done for the tech integration, getting things online. So all that essentially needs to be recuperated at some point, and that will be reflected in a fee structure. So those things, we just need to align on those. And then there's a draft agreement. We will loop in the third party's software vendor, either Engaza or PayG at this case. Hopefully there'll be others joining soon. And once we have a tripartite meeting, if you like, we will agree on the format of the data, because all distributors will handle the data slightly different, even if it's within the same structured framework of a given software provider. We agree on the format. We essentially initiate the export sequence. Once it's done, we do a few weeks of testing to ensure that everything runs smoothly. We do manual imports to ensure that it functions. And once that is in place, we automate it and we essentially launch it. So from first contact until issuance, if everything kind of runs smoothly, we can do that within 2 to 3 months. So it's a big, step forward compared to setting up, a traditional project, which first of all is too costly and it will take you years, 3, 4, 5 years before you actually have credits ready to sell.
Okay, got it. This is very useful. 2 to 3 months as opposed to a few years. That is really a big difference. One thing that you said earlier is you obviously generate carbon credit in the micro fashion on a daily basis. So would the company get paid on a daily basis also, or at least a monthly basis?
Yes. So the way we currently do this is that we pay companies on a monthly basis. So we sell it on an ongoing basis. If people buy it, just running you through the flow of things to make it kind of simple. So the stuff that we sell on our website, let's say a small event agency wants to make their event CO2 neutral. We have engaged with them about how much their footprint would be. They go into the website and they directly, as a self-service, would buy, let's say, 20, 25 tons carbon credits from the particular project that they have decided to support. That money goes through a Stripe payment to us, so we receive the money. What then happens from the buyer perspective is that we issue a certificate to them for the carbon offsets that they have bought, which have been retired from the registry. So that certificate has the added value that it's not just a PDF where we kind of signed off and they need to trust that it's valid. There's a QR code and a clickable hash on it. And if you scan it with your phone, it will open up the registry and you can actually verify what you have actually bought. And usually it would be hundreds of lines of payments, of carbon credits issued by specific solar home systems in that geography with very specific timestamps, and the ability for you to hover over them, and a small map will pop up and you can see exactly where those installations are located. So a lot of transparency. So that is, from the buyer perspective. So the Stripe accounts that funds that we receive, we will compile them, and once a month we will make an international wire transfer to the bank of the given distributor. And usually we would use Wise as a transfer. It used to be TransferWise, now they're called Wise. So essentially a Wise payment to a traditional bank payment to the account of the company. And then we keep track of the balance. So essentially how much has been issued, how much have we sold, how much do we owe the company, and we settle that on a monthly basis with the partners.
It makes sense. That's, again, a big advantage for companies to get paid on a monthly basis. It seemed to be hearing you speak that the process of onboarding companies isn't too complicated. You're examining, basic things actually about the credibility and about the projections. And I wanted to spend a minute talking about, while you today to work with the NGs in the Greenlight Africa, obviously you probably know that local entrepreneurs in Africa are struggling to raise capital, right? Do you have a message for them to sort of start getting onto your platform and selling carbon credits?
Absolutely. And we are often engaging with companies that are, you could say, local, that are growing up in this context, that really understand the problem, that want to contribute to energy access with different models, either inspired by what they see some of the bigger companies doing or giving it a little twist one way or the other. And it's always inspiring to have these chats with them. You could say that the path to market, in the sense that they will be able to generate carbon offsets on our platform, we try to let them know that at the early stages of their development, they probably don't have the volume required in terms of deployed systems yet to actually allow them to meet the threshold where this actually makes financial sense. But we're willing to work with them in order to acknowledge or weigh in on their potential funding rounds. Essentially, they can use us as an item line on their potential budgets that they're putting together in order to get funding, under the assumption that they put in, the right volume. So as soon as they hit, let's say, 500 solar home system deployed, by then they would be able to join our system because the economies of it would make sense. They would be able to issue a backlog of a few years of carbon credits, and going forward, they will have a certain number of metrics for how much they could actually generate. That would look good in their financial projections, which in turn they will be using for their funding rounds that they're trying to put forward. And it also makes them stand out because they're taking this funding revenue stream seriously and integrating it into the way that they're trying to build their business from the outset. So we do have these chats with the smaller of the local companies, but also we are aware that some of them are much larger and that are not necessarily, the international brand that have corporate headquarters in Europe or the US, but are actually local. And we want to support this, not just when it comes to giving them access to the carbon market, but also ensuring that manufacturing and assembly of these systems and more of the employment benefits that they can remain as local as possible, so that we can also bring in an upgrading of the workforce in those geographies. It's something like we know, for example, Nigeria is quite focused on trying to ensure that a lot of the manufacturing is done locally. There's a lot of funds that are looking into that. For example, Olan, that you might be familiar with, that works very actively for energy access in Nigeria, in particular, has a specific focus on keeping things local, ensuring that the technology is implemented in a local type of setting, the manufacturing and so on. So we're just an extra piece, you could say an ecosystem add-on, all these very good initiatives that are already happening. And if to boil it down to one message to, you could say, African entrepreneurs, well, reach out to us, have a chat with us if you are in the business of doing off-grid systems, whether they are mini grids or microgrids, or whether it's the distribution of solar home systems, because there might be room for collaboration. If not at this particular point, because the scale hasn't been achieved yet, then we can at least collaborate on figuring out how to position, the future carbon revenues as something that can become a pitchable, attribute that would make the company more attractive for potential investors.
I think that's very important. And I think local entrepreneurs or even nonprofits in Africa who are building a social enterprise wing should actually reach out to you. And I hope they do. I hope the podcast helps you to do that as well. We've talked a lot about the sell side of it. Let's switch to the buy side of it, which is, you've already mentioned, there's people who buy carbon credits on your website as, let's say, small event organizers. And they're buying those premium carbon credits at $26. But maybe you can tell us a little bit about the people who buy the larger bulk amounts. So are you seeing some traction with these new net zero declarations by the companies?
Very, very good point. And as with everything new, things take some time to actually get off the ground. And you could say, although a lot of the attributes that I've tried to put forward here should make it pretty straightforward, that there is a lot of co-benefits to these types of credits. We add some sort of transparency. We still, the data element of it makes it pretty trustworthy, we believe. But this being said, you still have a supply and demand in terms of volume that needs to align. So we're talking here about a lot of distributors of solar home systems that if you look at them, individually as one distributor, and you aggregate their, the volumes that they're selling, a lot of them would disappear under the radar of a big buyer, because what they're looking at buying is 5, 10, 15, 30 tons of CO2 a year. It requires a pretty big distributors to reach those volumes. So say for us, it has been a question of trying to showcase the power of aggregation, of putting all these smaller players together into a marketplace of sorts where you can actually buy this with a tamper-proof registry and what have you, and then ensuring that we sell it to buyers who, in terms of appetite for carbon credits, is aligned with the actual availability that each distributor would have. So small companies and selling through the website at a premium price is the best match currently for a lot of the smaller partners that we're working with. In terms of the larger ones, here it becomes a different case, because it might actually make sense to sell it in larger volumes. And here there's been some challenges in the sense that usually a large corporation would buy their carbon offset credits through a retailer. They would have a partnership with one of the large retailers, that is Climate Partner and the likes, Carbon Fund. There's a bunch of those that essentially cater to companies with a turnkey solution, which is essentially both helping them with the calculations on carbon emissions. So what is the footprint? How do you do, scope 1, 2, 3 calculations? How do you account this in the right format that is aligned with the greenhouse gas protocol and science-based targets? And so they help them on that side of things to ensuring that the amount that they're purchasing is correct. And then they will, as an add-on, connect them with projects that they're contracting with the programs and projects that are actually developing these things. And here there is certain risk aversion, I would say. And, everybody's lurking at these new data-driven solutions. First of all, to be fair, generally the volumes are not big enough to actually really make a difference for the big buyers right now, but hopefully it will become so as we aggregate more on the supply side. But also there is going to be hopefully a move away from a reliance only on the established types of projects, particularly when supply and demand, that inflection point is reached where the demand greatly outstrips the supply. And we think, from talking to retailers that are catering to the big Fortune 500 companies and so on, they can already see that the demand for quality carbon credits is high, but the availability is really not there. And also there is a lot of backlog, for example, on the CDM registry, with old vintage stuff from centralized projects that where you could say additionality is not really clear. There's been a few cases where it's kind of uncertain whether the actual avoidance really took place or whether it was issued on a too lean, too lax type of basis. So, and now with COP26, part of this backlog has been removed, so it doesn't count anymore in the new system, but you can actually still buy stuff from 2013 forward to 2020. So it's actually quite a lot of stuff there that is usually sold at a cheaper price. But at some point, this pool of available cheap credits is going to dry up. And from what we hear talking to retailers, this is actually already happening. Currently, they have to work harder in order to get these new types of quality projects where the co-benefits and the added social impact aligning with SDGs, in our case, SDG 7, for example, all these things are gaining momentum. So at some point, you will have these retailers actually taking the leap of faith and saying, well, although it's not verified carbon standard, but something new, essentially third-party verified by DNV, but based on a data-driven model, for example, such as the things that we do. Once that happens and there is enough, traction, we believe a snowball effect is going to happen. Once the floodgates are opened up and people actually make our product available, it will be quite easy to sell, larger volumes, but probably not that expensive at this stage. We've sold, the market indicates to us that the price point for batches of 1,000 tons would be around 10 euros per ton. So it's considerably less. But if you look at it from a broader perspective, it's one transaction. It's all handled all in once. And sometimes you can even make a future purchase contract. So essentially a carbon purchase contract, locking in a future issuance of credits. So that might actually take away some of the risk perception from some of the producers, and it makes it easier to match the gap. So I would say from my perspective and the way I see the market evolving, there is a general tendency that is only going upwards when it comes to price. But in our specific case, we're still trying to get to a situation where the supply is actually big enough for it to become attractive to the buyers that actually want to buy in the tens of thousands of tons at a time. Here, it requires more of the big players to give us more of their systems available to our registry so we can issue or aggregate, everything which is actually there. And the supply in terms of off-grid solar deployment every year is considerable. So if you aggregate that, there should definitely be enough to meet the demand going forward, but also with a price point, we think, going upwards. And just a final note that I think is important to mention to the listeners here is that what we actually do, we can obviously not guarantee sales. So the strength of our solution is the fact that we make carbon credits available for off-grid solar providers or distributors at a very affordable cost. And it's very easy and quick for them to actually get the credits available. They're third-party verified, they're transparent. It's kind of the next generation thing, we would venture to say. But we are not a sales organization per se. So we do offer retail services where we try to push it to the customers to get them to buy, because that's also where we make our money, because the incentives pretty much aligned. We only recuperate our money once we actually sell the carbon credits and we split the revenues. So we have an interest in doing that, but that's not the core of our strength of our business. Ultimately, a good way of seeing it is that we enable the distributors to generate a digital asset, essentially, that has a value, and a value which has an upwards going trend in terms of price. And they are then free to sell them whenever they want to sell them as the market matures. We can help them sell it now in small batches as we can, but forever, you could say the credits, as long as they're on the registry, do not belong to Solstream. We don't own them. It is the provider that owns them, and they can sell them to whoever they want, as long as they meet minimum price points that allows them to pay the fees once they sell to us, essentially. And generally, we like to see it as a concerted effort where all parties involved, so the distributors and ourselves, need to make the availability of these credits known to the buyers and try to push the methodology and the way it's done and the importance of data-drivenness, co-benefits, and so on and so forth, so that to open up their appetite and their willingness to actually buy these types of products. And we have some very good, pilot cases that we're up and running currently with big buyers that are actually interested in buying some of the stuff from some of the big partners that we're working with. So things will mature, but again, viewing it as an asset that is being created that can, in principle, be collateralized for your fundraising purposes, that you can sell whenever you want. I think that's really the current strength of this system. And going forward, as the liquidity of the market increases and the demand for these types of things increases, it would be a good way to supplement your cash flow strategically when it's actually needed by these players. So I hope that kind of explains where we see things going.
I think that's really clear, and I'm glad that you defined it so sharply. That is what you're doing is you're not owning the assets, you're creating the assets. The assets are owned by the distributor or the company, and the assets can be used as collateral for perhaps getting a loan or something like that, right? Or perhaps, as you said earlier, co-funding the expansion along with external capital. I think we're coming to the end of the podcast. And one of the interesting things that I read about your technology is that it allows the generation and sale of carbon credits, even if your own company stopped operating. I think that's really interesting. So can you help us understand how that is possible?
Well, the registry at the core of this that essentially holds the credits once they're issued is based on a distributed ledger system that we've developed with Active Ledger, which is a distributed ledger company based out of London. They are also a minority shareholder in Solstream. So the principle here is that all the data, the whole full registry is essentially duplicated on all the servers on which it runs. And the point here is we only run one of the servers. Currently, to be fair, we are in a bootstrapped mode, meaning that we still need to get more partners to take on the responsibility of running, a node, as we call it, or a server, which essentially has a completely updated version of the distributed ledger. Which means that ultimately, hopefully within a year or so, when some of the big partners that we work with also take on the responsibility of running a node, which is really not that expensive. It's run on the cloud, and it doesn't require anything of them. It just means that they are the custodians or the guardians of that particular ledger. And the industry as a whole, all the stakeholders could all run these nodes. And meaning that if you run out of business, the registry will prevail, as long as there is at least 4 servers still up and running. And this, in principle, adds the trust that if we're, for some reason, taken out of business or what have you, the registry itself would be able to maintain itself as it's a public good that is for the industry, that everybody that is partners can run a node, and it sustains, the registry for everybody and not just for us. And we are not able to tamper with it, which is also one of the main points. We can't go in and retrospectively remove or add or change anything in the registry without it synchronizing automatically with all the other servers, and that will kind of showcase us as being a fraudulent player. So it serves the purpose of extra security and trust, but it also ultimately means that if we're removed from the equation at some point, the whole system will prevail.
Thank you. I think you have obviously well summarized the business, the company, and I'll just make a couple of quick points. Companies can come in very easily. You're making it easier and easier for companies to come in and participate in the carbon market, which will probably mean democratization of this marketplace. They can create an asset which can then they can leverage for fundraising and expansion. And on the buyer side, what you're really giving them is verifiable, high quality carbon credits with social benefits, which are not subject to fraud.
That is a very, very good summary. I think that's exactly what we want to do and what we are doing and how we want to be perceived.
Okay, and thank you very much.
So thanks a lot for that, Sanjoy.